that the government bluntly just didn't get it. But you're content, are you, that it did?
I think how you define the words "get it." I think I'm content that the government was in receipt of the information from SAGE and the fact that people on SAGE felt urgency was needed. And this escalated, and you can see this in the SAGE minutes. So, in fact, this escalates further beyond the 12th. Did I think that all parts of the Downing Street machinery equally was seized of the urgency of it? I was not. But in a sense, the job of Sir Patrick and me, amongst others, but also perfectly reasonably, Dr. Warner, Mr. Cummings and others, was to try and ensure that people in the centre did understand the urgency of action. Because I think, and this goes back to the discussion we had yesterday, and I think this is quite a key point, the numbers we're talking about on the face of it at this point that were actually being reported were small. So if I can look, this is the 14th, I think we're talking about, of March. Is that correct?
The emails, the internal emails were the 12th.
Yeah, so at this point, 590 cases have been reported and 10 deaths. Of course, we knew subsequently that they were higher than that. What I think people were really not able to conceptualise was how exponential growth would turn from those apparently smaller numbers, still each one a tragedy, but smaller numbers, to really very large numbers in an extremely short period of time because of the doubling time. And I think this bit, I think, is a period where getting that through, I think, was not always straightforward.
Can you elaborate, please, Professor, on which parts of the system, in your view, might not have, to use that phrase, got it? You said, obviously, your task was to make sure they did understand. That was one of your primary functions. But there were plainly difficulties in getting the message across, and it being received in a proper manner. Which parts of the system did you sense were just simply didn't appreciate the emergency, the immediacy of the problem and the exponential growth?
I think actually it was a relatively widespread lack of understanding of where we were going to head. I think the people who had been heavily involved in looking at this, and certainly Mr. Cummings was the one, but there were many others, I think had realised by now that this is heading in a very difficult direction. But I don't think everybody in the building did. So this was not an individual, and this is again a point I make repeatedly. This was a lot of people really not getting what exponential growth was actually going to mean.
They did, of course, subsequently fully understand.
Yeah.
Can I now turn, please, to the issue of herd immunity?
Yeah.
It is, you've described in your statement, technically possible for an infection to travel through a population naturally until such a point that population immunity is achieved. Enough people get infected that the virus stops. And that's population or herd immunity. There has been a very extensive debate, as you are very well aware, about whether or not herd immunity was ever a goal of government or an aim, as opposed to being a byproduct of any system of control or countermeasures being applied that doesn't drive the system and the country down to zero COVID. Of course, it's going to spread in some shape or form. To get some idea of the scale, what percentage of the population, as it transpired, was infected by COVID, the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, by June 2020? So just so we can get a feel for how extensive the prevalence was in the infections rate.
By June 20, well, I do have those data, but I don't have them.
Very roughly.
But very roughly, let me go back a step, because I think, in a sense, I'm cautious even of the possibility that herd immunity was achievable at all, as ordinarily understood. And I think that's a caveat. Let us make an assumption that at the extreme example where COVID infection provided lifelong immunity completely, so you get an infection, you will never get another infection. Even that, you would then need to, with the force of transmission we had, achieve, for the sake of argument, around 80% of the population would have had to have become infected with all the attendant risks. That's the key point which many of the people who didn't understand this did not get. And at the end of June, after an appalling first wave in which many people died, from memory, I think less than 20% of the population had been infected. I wouldn't want to be held to that number.
No, just a broad figure.
Well short of what you'd have needed, even had herd immunity been a possibility. But as I said in my witness statement, I spent much of my professional career dealing with infections for which herd immunity is never achieved, herd immunity as normally understood. So essentially, so that's the first point. The second point is herd immunity was used in two completely different ways, the term was, and this caused confusion to those who were confused by herd immunity, which in my view was a lot of people. Some people were meaning the herd immunity threshold. This is the point you're talking about, the point at which, for practical purposes, further waves are unlikely, which is very high. The modelers were using it in the sense of a gradually increasing levels of immunity, meaning that the effective force of transmission gradually decreases, but not to the point where there's no waves. And I think there was muddled up between those two completely different uses of the term. And frankly, and I touched on this yesterday, there was a large amount of chatter about this by people who had at best half understood the issue. So I think it became very confused. And as you will have seen from my correspondence, my only contribution on this, really up to the point of about the 20th of March, was to say to people, this is very complicated, please don't talk about it. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I thought that a very uninformed discussion was forming that was not helping policy making.
Is that a reference, in fact, to WhatsApps that you sent to and from the Secretary of State and others in a CSA, CMO, PM group where you caution against the direction that the public debate about herd immunity has taken, and you try to put it in its proper context?
Well, my view was it was a clearly ridiculous goal of policy and a very dangerous one, and I thought a lot of what was being said could have led to considerable confusion, and indeed did. And I think I've laid out several times in public, and I did in my statement, my view that it would have been inconceivable that this should have been an actual goal of policy, because it would have led to extraordinarily high loss of life, even if it had been achieved, which in reality it would probably not have been in the ordinary sense.
Nevertheless, the phrase herd immunity was, of course, used by Sir Patrick publicly, but by members of government, by some ministers and officials and advisors. Could you just explain further, please, what, if I may call it this, what the problems are with herd immunity? You explain in your statement that the more transmissible an infection is, the higher the proportion of the population needs to be in order for the population to become immune through this herd immunity or population immunity. And we're putting aside completely the question of vaccines. So, as you described, you need to get to a very high level for this ever to work, if it can ever be said to work at all. What problems, generically, may be encountered if you were, for argument's sake, to seek to pursue such a policy? Is that significant part of the population which becomes open to infection, does it still remain at risk from, obviously, hospitalization or death in terms of the impact of the infection?
Well, I mean, the first thing, just to, you say, setting aside vaccines, the one situation, in my view, and I've said this before this pandemic, and it's a fairly widespread view about those who understand herd immunity, that you would ever aim to achieve herd immunity is by vaccination. That is the only situation that is a rational policy response. So just, I just wanted to make that clear. There are, the first question is, can you achieve it at all? And we had no idea whether, even in a theoretical situation, the population would, by natural infection, even get to the herd immunity threshold, first point. But much more importantly, in the short term, essentially what you're saying, if you go up to that threshold, which for the sake of argument is 80% of the population, were that to be the case, all of those people carry all of the risks of an infection. And meaning well, overall 1%, but in people who've got higher risks, older citizens, people with disabilities, people with immunosuppression and so on, very significant risks of mortality. So the impact of that on mortality would be very severe. And I laid this out in a paper around the 21st, I think, of March to Number 10, various other people, because I wanted them to understand this point, which I thought had become extremely muddled in the public debate. This will lead. The only situation where that wasn't going to be the case was if there was a huge amount of asymptomatic transmission we were not detecting. In all other circumstances, we would have been in a situation where very large loss of life would have occurred had that been attempted.
So for that part of the population, which is unable to be shielded or cocooned or segmented, however you describe it, it remains at risk of hospitalization, of death, and therefore it just doesn't work because they're already and they remain open to infection. Secondly, in practice, is it possible to hermetically seal particular segments of the population in order that they may not be open to infection under such a policy, were it to be pursued?
So I think that you may want to come back to the system we call shielding, but I always thought it was wholly impractical for multiple reasons to try and achieve that.
Right.
And the two, there are two in particular. The first one is, in a sense, theoretical. Let's say theoretically you could achieve a complete barrier between the virus and those people, and my view was that was never going to be achievable. We'll come back to that. These people would have to be in isolation for incredibly long periods of time. And that doesn't matter whether that's the Great Barrington Declaration kind of model or the model that was proposed by Professor Woolhouse or whatever. This is long periods of isolation for people who are very vulnerable, often in later stages of their life. So there were practical reasons. And then I could not see a situation where something which was so transmissible from people who were at least pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic, as we subsequently became confident, would not eventually catch it anyway. So the idea you could somehow provide this barrier struck me as wholly impractical for those reasons as well. So I just thought, the various attempts on this were theoretically perfectly, you could debate them, but they were clearly not going to work, and they were clearly going to lead to significant loss of life. So in my view. So that was why I was extremely cautious of them.
And is there another issue in relation to the notion or the assumption that those people who, through population immunity, become infected, through this herd immunity process, become infected, may not actually remain or become immune thereafter? That there's a risk that they may in fact become reinfected at a later stage. So it simply wouldn't work.
Exactly, and as indeed happened with COVID. And I think there is a big difference, and we are, in a sense, the fact that all of us are able to have this meeting here in an open room is because most people are protected firstly by vaccination, but they're also protected against severe disease. So even were people who otherwise are not vulnerable to disease to catch disease, their immune system will stop them getting to the point of intensive care or potentially dying. That's different from herd immunity. That's to do with individual protection against severe disease. So that's in a sense, they're not different sorts of immunity, although there is a large amount of technical issues around that. But the fact is, you can get a disease a second time much less severely than the first time. That still means you catch it and still means you can transmit it with many infections. COVID is just one of them.
Now, you've referred to the Great Barrington Declaration, which is a proposition, if you like, arguing for focused protection, a degree of segmentation or shielding, which allows infection otherwise to spread through lower risk parts of the population. So in your view, is that a variant, if you like, on a herd immunity goal?
Yes.
Scientifically and ethically, does it follow from what you said that you had very grave doubts about the wisdom of such an approach or such a declaration?
Yes, I thought it was flawed at multiple levels. I thought it made an assumption of full immunity that would be lifelong, which they didn't state, but was an assumption which I thought was extremely unclear and indeed proved to be incorrect. As demonstrated, as you just said, I considered the idea you could properly shield all the right people or identify all the right people. And just to take the case of Mr. Johnson, the Prime Minister, he would not have been someone, I think, who would have been considered someone you would be put into this group. He got very severe COVID. He's an example of the kind of person who you would not have been able to identify. Those you correctly identified, you wouldn't have been able to shield. And the result of this would have been you'd have had long periods of isolation, at the end of which people would still have got COVID anyway. So the idea that this was a sensible proposition struck me as zero, actually.
The inquiry has seen, nevertheless, multiple references to herd immunity, of course, in emails, in WhatsApps, in Sage minutes, and really across the board. And publicly, the idea did take hold, or the understanding did take hold, to the effect that the government was pursuing, to greater or lesser extent, a policy of herd immunity. How did that come about then, in light of what are very plain concerns that you've expressed about the wisdom or validity of any such approach? How did this happen?
Well, I can answer half of that, I think. I mean, there's no doubt that rightly the modelers and others were looking at this in their models to work out what would happen over time as people got infected. That's a perfectly appropriate thing to do. It was not to do with threshold of herd immunity. This was to do with the gradual accretion of population immunity whenever there's going to be transmission.
Working out what was likely to happen.
That was simply a calculation question. They were using it in that sense. And my view is herd immunity is the wrong term to use for that, because it has, for most people's understanding, it means the herd immunity threshold after vaccination, which is exactly how I think it was interpreted by others. So I think that debate was a perfectly proper intellectual exercise that modelers in particular were undertaking, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that. Then I think there were some people who ran with this, but I thought in a rather confused way, in trying to explain what would happen over time as waves of infection went through. My view was that wasn't a helpful conversation, which is what I was trying to say to people. And then there undoubtedly were some people who were seriously thinking, without having thought it through. I don't think, if they thought it through, I don't think they would have thought, but I do think there were some people who were genuinely thinking, well, this will go through and then it'll be passing, it'll be fine in a short period. And I think that, those are different areas. In general, my view is debating science in public is exactly the right thing to do. This is an area where I think it got extremely confused, and I don't think helped the debate, because it was not based, in my view, on a proper understanding of the issues concerned.
So, Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I just go back to the Great Barrington Declaration? In your opinion, that approach was flawed, but there were other experts who thought that it was the right way to go. Would the policy that those who signed the declaration promoted, would that not have bought some time? So, for example, for the development of vaccination, would it necessarily have to be the long-term isolation that you talked about?
Well, you were right. You were right that. Well, firstly, it's quite rare that I actually say of a group of distinguished other academics, I utterly disagree with what you're saying. This is one of those few occasions. I think they were just wrong, straightforwardly. The second thing is that you were right that if this had been posited as we know the vaccine's just around the corner, we've seen some vaccines that work, we've got 6 months, you could make the argument, but in that case, why not wait to do it with the vaccine anyway? Because you've got a way of achieving herd immunity safely, relatively to infection, big caveat. A vaccine would achieve this without having to go through any of these processes. But that wasn't actually what they were suggesting. They were suggesting this, in a sense, absent a vaccine. They weren't suggesting you had to wait for a vaccine as part of their approach. So I just thought it had a very large number of problems with it, and I thought it was one of the few areas where I thought it was sensible to knock it really hard out of the court rather than say this is an interesting point, let's debate it.
Can I bring you back to my earlier question, please, Professor, which was this? It's obvious that there were advisors in Number 10 and government ministers and officials and members of the press and large swathes of the public who understood that the government was pursuing a deliberate policy of herd immunity. On that premise, and you may or may not disagree, but on that premise, how did they come to understand or to hold that belief? Ministers and advisors and commentators were all talking about herd immunity, and therefore it may have reasonably been assumed that that was a policy of government. Were you able to stop what was a canard being pursued in this way? I mean, was it open to you to try to stop this debate and to make plain that any idea that the government was deliberately pursuing a policy of herd immunity was just wrong?
Yeah, I tried to do three things, but this is one of those debates, as you probably would have worked out from the various sort of things you've seen, I tried to largely stay out of, but I wanted to do three things. Firstly, for the small number of people who actually thought this was a good idea initially, entirely based on the fact they hadn't understood it, I tried to make sure they did understand it and to realise that the implications of this were not what they thought it was. Secondly, I tried to encourage people not to try and discuss what I thought was a very complex issue, because immunity is, we've just scratched on the surface. Actually, we could have had an hour and a half on this and we'd still be going on how immunity and how it accrues. It's a very complex area of policy. So I tried to discourage this. And thirdly, whenever asked, I stated, because it was true, that this was never a policy of government. And all the things that SAGE was recommending, which were about reducing R below 1, which I was talking about all the way through February, are by definition completely incompatible with a policy of trying to achieve herd immunity, which in any case is the wrong policy. Our aim was to get R below 1, therefore to reduce the number of people infected rightly. That was the correct policy response. And by definition, that's going the opposite way to achieving herd immunity. So in a sense, our policy was the exact opposite of one of trying to encourage infection, which I thought was a foolish approach to take.
But in a general sense, the government failed collectively to understand what you were saying. And for a number of weeks, in fact, it did, in various different ways, and again, this is not a personal issue, it did in various different ways promote and was seen to promote herd immunity as a goal. And that was an error.
I don't think anybody, I've never saw anybody on the record or anybody sensible aiming for it as a goal. I think some people tried to explain it as this is what would happen over time. I think, frankly, unhelpfully, but we'll talk about probably no doubt my own communication errors, and I definitely made communication errors through the pandemic. But my view was this is an area where the communications were a long way from helpful to the public, which is really what they should be about, because it gave an impression the government was pursuing a policy which it absolutely was not pursuing, and reasonably people were upset about that policy because it would have been the wrong policy, but it wasn't the policy.
You said you never saw anybody on the record or anybody sensible aiming for it as a goal. Can we just be quite clear about that? There were government ministers and unnamed individuals who did openly say that they understood that herd immunity would become established, to use the words of the commentators, and it was the use of those sorts of phrases and words that led to this understanding that it was a goal. Is that the nub of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the passive "it would become established" (brackets misunderstanding of the science, but in good faith on brackets) is quite different from actively trying to achieve it as a policy goal. So I don't think even those anonymous briefings, I don't think were saying the aim of it was going to happen, but I think it was essentially a mashed up understanding of some papers based on modelling which were not aiming for this as a goal at all. And I think if we were to go back in terms of our communication errors along the way, and there were a lot, this is firmly one of the ones where I think we didn't help the public by having a debate that I think quite rightly upset and confused a lot of people.
Can we now look at behavioural fatigue? You may take the view that that's another area in which there was a communication difficulty or infelicity. The material shows very plainly that there were debates within government. We've seen a witness statement from Mr. Johnson, which he describes how he was told by you that there were limits to human patience, to the willingness of the population to do as they were told. It's essential to get timing right. There were press conferences, as you're very well aware, in which there were references to people becoming understandably fatigued. The notion that people would become fatigued was not a surprising one, was it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one where my communications were really poor, frankly, and I said in my statement, this is probably my most prominent, at least in my view, communications error. So I think probably let's separate out three separate things. The first one is, was there a lot of debate around whether over the period of the pandemic, that's an important point, people would become more and more I'm going to use the word fatigue for the sake of argument, and it would become less easy for people to continue, less easy for people to support something. And those debates were happening, there's no two ways about that, and there's a large academic literature on this, most of which is not in the UK. If you put in pandemic fatigue and COVID into Google Scholar or PubMed, you'll get large numbers of papers, hundreds of papers, discussing it, not discussing my views, discussing it in general. There was a WHO conference on pandemic fatigue in October 2020. So this idea was in the general sphere. Yeah. There was then a debate, rightly, in Sage about this, in part triggered by me talking about it foolishly in press conferences, in which I think it was around about the 13th of February from memory.
9th and 12th.
Okay, 9th, 12th, apologies. And in that, the end result of that was a statement by Sage firmly that this should not be taken as a reason to delay an action. And from that point onwards, not only did I not say anything more about it, because I was rightly told off by my behavioural science colleagues, because the way I'd phrased it, which is behavioural fatigue, almost implied that it had come from them, which it absolutely had not. And I want to put on the record, it definitely did not come from them. And secondly, they pointed out the fact that I'd explained it very poorly, which I had, and so I stopped. And I also steered other people away from doing so. So when other people said, how should we describe this thing? I said, don't. It's a bad idea. My fault. This has entered parlance. So in a sense, the concept was not unreasonable. The debate was not unreasonable. But the discussion of it in public and linking it to the first lockdown were really unhelpful. And that's entirely on me on this one.
And absolutely fairly, Professor, in your internal emails with the Secretary of State and other government ministers and advisors, you acknowledge it was a bad term and your fault to have used it. But I want to be absolutely plain where the choke point is in this. It wasn't that the idea that people would become exhausted and fatigued by interventions, by countermeasures, and perhaps that would impact on compliance, that was the problem. It was the notion that the fairly sensible, commonsensical point that they would become exhausted by countermeasures was thought to have its foundations in behavioural science or some sort of technical understanding.
Well,
that was the problem.
Well, there were two problems, I think. There was that, which was my bad use of language entirely. But the other one was there were very good reasons, as we discussed yesterday, why it was important not to start any activity before you needed to, because of all the downsides that come from big social interventions, school and lockdown in particular. This one was really irrelevant to those discussions, and muddling it up with those discussions was, in my view, unhelpful. So that was, in a sense, it was a double bad hit from that point of view.
Right.
It was a useful thing, though, in my opinion, and I'm not sure my behavioural science colleagues would agree, to think about over the pandemic arc as a whole, which in my view was where we really had to be. And just numerically, if you look at subsequent lockdowns, for example, which were much more contested than the first one, they occurred at a much later stage with many more deaths, unfortunately, many more cases than they did on the first one, because by this stage, people's, in a sense, barrier to wanting to do this, at least politically, possibly personally, had moved on. And those countries that maintained a zero COVID approach, by the end of their period, I think found quite considerable difficulties in taking the population with them in some cases. So I think, if you view it over the pandemic as a whole, it's not an unreasonable thing to consider, but absolutely should not have been linked to, and I would completely accept this, the first decisions on exactly the timing of the first wave. And that's what SAGE said, and that was therefore the advice very firmly that Patrick Vallance and I gave subsequent to SAGE, and it was in the minutes. It's reasonably clear on that, I think.
Before turning to look at the first lockdown, which we need to do in some detail, I just want to raise a couple of other issues. And could I just invite you to try to give your answer as concisely as possible?
Apologies.
No, there's no need to apologise, but we're very much constrained by time. On the 13th of March, there was a SAGE meeting, 109-142. At pages 2 to 3, SAGE says this: SAGE was unanimous, if I can, it may be over on page 3. SAGE refers, yes, point 24, thank you. SAGE was unanimous that measures seeking to completely suppress spread of COVID-19 will cause a second peak. SAGE advises that it is a near certainty that countries such as China, where heavy suppression is underway, will experience a second peak once measures are relaxed. Was that, in your understanding, a reference to the debate that we had yesterday about uncoiled spring?
Yes, and essentially what it's saying is, if you can choose to go for a complete suppression one, but if you do so, there will be an exit wave.
Yes.
That's an inevitability. And indeed, as I said, countries which have gone down that route did have an exit wave, fortunately, after vaccination.
SAGE was unanimous. Do we take it, therefore, that that was a view to which you ascribed?
I consider it a statement of fact.
Indeed.
That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It's simply a statement of epidemiological fact that would occur as a result, absent an incredibly effective vaccine.
And, of course, the consequence of that unanimous view, Professor, was that SAGE was concerned that whatever countermeasures might be proposed and implemented would bring about the very thing which they were warning against there. That's the nub of the debate or the concern.
No, I would put it slightly differently, actually. I would say that if policymakers wanted to go, and it was a legitimate debate to have for policy leaders, for a complete suppression approach, which would have meant long periods of significantly more severe lockdowns than we had, because you have no immunity to help you at all, then you had to accept that it wasn't you just do that and at the end of it there would be no COVID. You'd have to do that and at the end of it you'd have to accept there would still be a wave. Now, it might be a wave much later down when there were medical countermeasures. There are large numbers of legitimate arguments, but what you shouldn't do is go into this saying this is going to mean we will never have any COVID at all. That was not on the cards epidemiologically, and I don't think anyone who understands epidemics would dispute this statement as a statement of fact.
All right. Now, during the weekend of the 14th and 15th of March, there were, as you know, and you attended many of these meetings, and a number of meetings and a great deal of debate within Number 10 as to whether or not the countermeasures which had already been imposed, in fact on the 12th of March, were going to be adequate in light of the understanding, the dawning realization that we were further ahead on the epidemiological trajectory than we understood, and that the consequences of that were going to be very severe indeed. in very broad terms, the Prime Minister and officials and Cobra and Sage understood that further countermeasures were going to be required, and of course they were debated on the Monday, and they were brought into effect during the course of the week. To what extent over that weekend, Professor, was it appreciated that those countermeasures, the initial countermeasures of that week, might not be enough, and that a lockdown, a mandatory stay-at-home order, would have to be imposed? What was the degree, if any, of inevitability?
Well, I think, in a sense, I kind of take it in stages, because if we go back to our ladder of intervention in public health that I talked about yesterday, clearly what the ideal would be is to get R below 1 with the least disruptive combination of measures that can be achieved. So let's take that as a kind of the framework. What happened over this period was, in a sense, two separate things which intersected. Firstly, a realization that we were a lot further along the path, well, significantly further along the path than we had thought we were, meaning that a lot of thinking and a lot of activity had to be accelerated that we thought could have been done later, had to be brought forward in very short order. And the second was a realization that we were really not going to get on top of this with anything other than quite a large number of measures. Now, in theory, had the force of transmission been somewhat lower, it might have been possible to get on top of them, get R below 1 reliably, that's a key word, reliably, short of a full mandatory lockdown, in theory. But once we got to above a certain point of force of transmission, based on the modelling we had, with all the caveats that go with that, it looked extremely unlikely that we could reliably get to that stage. So I think we shouldn't see it as a sort of a yes-no on this. My view was that the measures that were brought in on the 16th by the Prime Minister, the stay-at-home orders and so on, were virtually inevitable and had been, in my view, for some time. It was a matter of when, rather than whether. That was a huge intellectual Rubicon that, in my view, that the government crossed at that stage, and I was very relieved on the 16th when that occurred, actually. As I say, we hadn't realised how close to that point we were until very shortly before it. So that's that direction.
Can I just interrupt there to say, may we presume from that you were concerned that those 16th of March measures may not have been applied quite soon enough?
Oh no,
you are obviously concerned
so
to make sure they were done.
So I think that there are two marginal areas where, in this area, I would have a slight deviation from the opinions of Sir Patrick. It's very slight, and it's an opinion, not a thing. I think it would have, if we were to run this again, hopefully none of us ever will, but in theory, I think we would have brought in the 16th of March measures several days earlier, not long time earlier, but several days earlier. And personally, I would have added into those the measures on stopping hospitality, because it seemed to me very strange that we had a segment of the economy, a very important segment of the economy under ordinary circumstances, whose principal function is bringing together households. That's its business model, at a time when not having households together was a good idea. So I think that now we know what the numbers are, now we know how it plays out, that's what we would now do. I'm not sure it was obvious at the time. I don't think, certainly prior to the 12th, I don't think many people were really saying this is the moment we have to do this. So the debate is essentially over a 4-day period at this stage. But
all right,
looking where we were now.
Can I pause you there?
Yeah.
It's very important that we understand the chronology. So when those measures were imposed on the 16th of March, there was room for debate as to how early they could have been imposed. There is some room for debate about whether they should have been imposed earlier, a few days earlier.
Yeah.
You've used the word reliable. There had to be an assessment of how reliable those measures would be. And obviously there was room for different views as to what that reliability might be, what the compliance would be, what the take-up would be in response. Can I ask you, please, therefore, how confident, what was the level of confidence in government that those 16th of March measures would work? Were they measures that were very much a roll of the dice? We better try this and we'll see what happens? Or are we confident that this will work and there will be no need for further, more stringent countermeasures? What was the thinking?
Certainly, I think that among the people who were debating this technically, there was a hope that they would work with some of the additions I've talked about on hospitality, but no confidence that they would work, and that was my position as well. And had this been a very slow-moving epidemic, and some infections move very slowly while still being a very profound HIV example, we could have afforded potentially to wait a few weeks and see what happened. But that clearly wasn't the situation with this. And the problem was because it was doubling so fast, if you waited the 3 weeks probably would take to get the information, you would be multiple doubling times away from where you were then. And so the word reliably was very important.
And do you say that there was, on the part of some or a significant number of people who mattered, no confidence that they would work, a desire to try this as a suite of measures or as a measure, because the alternative was a terrible thing to countenance, to go straight to, if it could practically be done, a full mandatory stay-at-home lockdown? This had to be tried in order to ensure that the next step perhaps might never occur.
I think so. This is the other bit where I think I slightly deviate from Sir Patrick again in matter of nuance, and this is entirely benefit of hindsight stuff. This is absolutely not what we were debating at the time. I don't think it's an absolute inevitability that the introduction of the measures on the 16th, plus issues around hospitality, in theory, couldn't have actually held the line, done at an early enough stage with a different infection. But
just pause there. At an early enough stage, so had they been introduced earlier,
yeah,
the chance that they might have worked goes up.
Goes up. Well, listen, the chance that you will know whether they have worked or not sufficiently goes up. But in practice, this was moving at such a speed that possibility, I think, was essentially not there anyway. And I don't think, this is all with the benefit of hindsight stuff. I think actually at the time, I think these were shunted together. So in practice, I think Sir Patrick's statement is in fact correct. I'm just saying in theory, you could separate out the decisions taken on the 16th, which I consider as to say, if you think where the philosophy, and I don't think he'd disagree with this, the philosophy of the then Prime Minister was, this change is almost antithetical to his whole philosophy of life, was my view at the time, and yet he still made it because we could see we were really staring into an incredibly difficult situation.
And is this the position also that plainly a government can introduce countermeasures, but they have to have practical effect and they have to be workable and they have to make sense in practical terms? There has to be built in necessarily a period of delay while appropriate places are put into place. For example, shielding. You can't just simply impose a shielding system overnight. Practical arrangements have to be made. So any order for a countermeasure of that type to be put into place has to take into account the need for the necessary preparations.
Yes, and I think there is that, but I also think that between the 16th and the 23rd, when the full lockdown came into place, I think three separate things happened. The first and the most important was that the realization that we were going to need to do more, or at least might well have to do more, and wouldn't have the time to find out, accelerated. And we had, and I think one of the most important things that we hadn't definitely come to this realization on certainly just before the 16th, the closure of education, which was for this kind of pandemic going to have to be for a long period if it happened at all. We were hoping that it would be possible to just about get away without doing that, and it became clear that didn't look a safe decision. I consider the decision to close education, except for key workers and vulnerable children, to be a really important step, which everybody saw was one we would try and avoid under all circumstances. Then I think the second thing is we became uncertain we were uncertain, and we didn't get any certainty to counteract that, whether the over 75% reduction in mixing of the population that the modelling implied we would definitely need to get R below 1 was going to be achieved by voluntary measures alone.
Yes.
And then I think the third one, which I think is often underestimated, is actually the British people, to my and most people's absolute lack of surprise, responded to this incredibly, and the voluntary measures were actually very firmly adhered to. And if you look at the approval of doing this in the general public at that stage, YouGov polling and others, over 90% of the population were in favour. But interestingly, what the polling also demonstrated was that the great majority of people said they were going to do it, but quite a much higher proportion of people said they weren't confident other people were going to do it. And that's a very corrosive situation. So slightly counterintuitively, the advantage of a mandatory lockdown is essentially says everybody in society is going to do this. So if you make a sacrifice, your family makes a sacrifice, so is everybody else. So I think it had that additional benefit, I think, of making clear to people that this was across the board. There weren't going to be anyone who anyone could see as freeloaders. This was simply we the state are going to reflect the wishes of we society, which is that everybody will do this to protect the most vulnerable. And I think it was that progression, I think, which got us to the position where we finally ended up on the 23rd.
All right. It's a very lengthy answer, understandably so. It's reflective of the thinking which was going on in the course of that week. I now want to come to the following weekend, so the weekend of the 20th, 21st, 22nd. You prepared a report on the 21st of March titled Coronavirus, Summary of Strategic and Tactical Approach to the Epidemic.
Yeah.
And I just, if you'll bear with me, I wish to try to summarise as best I can what that report meant. You set out in the report, in very clear terms, how coronavirus was capable of causing significant mortality. Direct mortality from people dying from the virus, deaths from the virus. Indirect deaths or indirect causes of mortality from the NHS emergency services being overwhelmed. A third cause, postponement of elective care and non-urgent medical treatments causing indirectly further deaths. And you also point to the very significant economic disadvantages and disparities, which meant that over the long term, there might be an increase in death from poor physical and mental health outcomes. So in that report, you set out from a technical public health angle how direct and indirect mortality needs to be lessened. Obviously, you are trying to reduce the number of deaths overall, directly and indirectly. That paper and its description of how the imperative in public health terms was to reduce death was obviously a major driver towards the final lockdown decision. You wouldn't have prepared the report otherwise. With that understanding, Professor, what weight in the ultimate analysis and the final decision-making was placed upon that report and your analysis in the decision to lock down, which of course comprised a myriad of different considerations, medical, public health, societal, economic, and so on and so forth. Was your report and your call for death to be reduced the game changer, if you like, on that Monday, on the Sunday night Monday?
No, I mean, I don't think it was. And to be really clear, I mean, these are points which I, Sir Patrick, and many others had been making before. This was not the first time.
Of course.
The reason for doing the report, and the reason I'm trying not to be hubristic about this, is, the reason for doing the report was I thought that there were quite a lot of unjoined up, perfectly sensible tactical decisions which didn't really take an overall strategic approach to the epidemic as a whole, not just the next few days, but actually over the course of the epidemic. And I wanted there to be a single document short enough for people in a hurry to read that actually laid out the strategy and then also the tactical pillars and then what the operational implications. So the reason for the report was a sort of pulling together of lots of strands that were already occurring in one place. And it was clearly already essential, it became more essential over time actually, to make clear to some of the senior policymakers that this would come to an end. Because the danger was they just saw this will be night without end, we'll be in a lockdown forever, and what are we going to do? So we needed to see there was a beginning, middle, and an end, and there was a logic to whatever was being done. But the report itself was simply a distillation of lots of things that were already going on. So in my view, it wasn't new knowledge, it was simply a bringing together. But it is Professor, my single...
I do apologise.
Yeah.
I must ask you, please, to focus on the question which is being asked for a reason, which is, to what extent do you assess, or what impact do you assess that report had on the ultimate decision-making? This was a report about reducing mortality. It was a report which called upon the government to be aware that the number of deaths, or what was potentially enormous, was going to be enormous unless steps were taken, and this was something the government had to address. What was the impact?
So my view is the reports was more for a long-term impact rather than to try and drive thinking around the immediate decision. That was actually my view about the report.
Right.
Many other discussions we're having with all of the same kind of elements as the report, but which were really saying we must do something, and based on the modelling, we're going to have to do it now and quite forcefully. But in a sense, those are happening in parallel, but they're all of a piece. But I wouldn't want...
I'm sorry, were you contributing, therefore, on the Sunday and the Monday to that debate directly by saying you've got to take the more stringent measures,
in a sense,
because of the death concerns?
Yes, I mean, I think I was, many others were, and in a sense the contemporaneous record of my views is this report and Sage Minutes. Those are really the two things which record them.
Right. So now, with that in mind, Professor, to what extent was there a debate on the Sunday and the Monday about what the level of direct mortality was likely to be, in light of any further countermeasures, that is to say the mandatory state order, the final step being imposed? Or putting it another way, how clear was the government that there would be a significant difference in the number of deaths, directly and indirectly, if a mandatory stay-at-home order were not to be imposed? What understanding was there of the impact of this decision-making on the likely number of deaths? Because death, bluntly, was, of course, the main driver in public health terms of the final lockdown decision.
So I think my view is that was the central driver. But it was also the recognition that it was the direct deaths from COVID, but also the deaths that would accrue were the NHS to be even more under pressure than it actually was, which was very substantially under pressure. So that's sort of my second form of indirect deaths. That was the other very major thing to prevent by using lockdown and other measures.
And we're going to look at the NHS the NHS position in a moment. But can I ask you the question, was there an understanding in any real sense of what the differences in figures would be, figures for death, the numbers of deaths, between the existing countermeasures, those of the 12th and 16th and 20th of March, and the final countermeasure on the 23rd of March? Did government, in a general sense, ask itself this question: will there be a significant difference in the number of deaths if we do impose this final mandatory stay-at-home order, or if we don't? Or can we just not tell?
What we were clear about, and the answer is yes, but by one remove, an important remove. And the remove was the key was to get R below 1. Because until that happens, the pandemic is doubling up every number of days. And it was clear that by the stage after the 16th, due to people's remarkable actions, the doubling up number was going to be extending. So it would not be maybe 3 days. It would certainly have gone on for longer, but it's still doubling. And we had to get to a point where it was halving, which is the key to get the R below 1. And we were not confident that the measures prior to the 23rd, based on the most recent data from the modelling groups, that getting the R below 1 was going to occur with sufficient confidence that we could just say, let's wait and see. So we had to move, if that was a decision of ministers that they wanted to reduce mortality.
And obviously, you could only opine on the public health aspect, on the question of direct or indirect mortality and the impact on the NHS and so on. Can you assist us with how that debate was framed, Professor? Did the debate focus predominantly around the need to get R below 1? Or did it become a debate more directly about having to act because of a belief that there would be significantly more death if they did not act in this way?
Well, in a sense, it was the second, but because the first was we were not sure of, because the key thing was getting the R below 1 and the pandemic to start to shrink.
So on this issue of
this wave, rather,
what the likely consequences would be if they didn't act on direct and indirect mortality, what degree of, or what was the degree, what figures, what data was available to essentially the Prime Minister and Cobra and Cabinet on that Monday in terms of what the differences would be in terms of deaths? Or was it just not something that could be calculated?
There were various models of it, but I think, and this goes back, I'm going to come back, I've come to this repeatedly, but I think it is important. Once you're in an exponential growth curve, the difference between two doubling times when you're in high numbers is absolutely massive numbers. So you know, even if you get it wrong by half a doubling time, by this point, you're still talking about a very, very big difference between one outcome and another. What we were not confident at this point, we were confident that if R continued to be above 1, firstly, a lot of people would die directly from COVID, and secondly, that the NHS would come under even greater pressure and potentially catastrophic pressure. And then,
can I come to the NHS?
Yeah, those were key. Those were key decisions. I thought that the exact numbers you want to put to those were at this point speculative, and in a sense didn't matter. We had to get R below 1.
Right.
It was absolutely essential.
And so, if I can attempt to summarise the nub of the position as the government saw it, it couldn't know and would never know precisely, or perhaps at all, what the differences in mortality would be if it did or did not act by imposing a lockdown. But it knew, because it was told by you, that when dealing with a viral pandemic with exponential growth, there had to be a step taken, because the nature of exponential growth is unless you do take that final ultimate step, it's going to continue exploding.
Yes.
Is that the nub of it?
Yes, and me and others, to be clear, but that is the nub of it.
So what do you say then to the suggestion that the government overreacted by way of the imposition of a lockdown because of an unfounded fear that there would be a significant increase in mortality if it did not act?
Well, firstly, I think, no one is absolutely certain exactly what had happened under that circumstance, but I think there is a high chance, I wouldn't like to put a percentage on it, but non-trivial certainly, that R would have continued above 1 and significantly above 1. And by this stage, we were talking about large numbers. So once you start doubling up from large numbers, even if it's over 4, 5, 6 weeks, you're still going to end up in a very, very difficult place. So I think it would have been very difficult to justify if the aim of ministers was to minimise mortality, which was very clearly their stated aim at this point, to continue where we were. We had to do something which would make it as close to, as good as we could get, that the numbers would definitely start to fall because R had fallen below 1. And we had seen, in a very different setting, in a different culture, etc., in China, this could be achieved. So it wasn't that this was a theoretical possibility. This had been achieved elsewhere, and we therefore needed to try and achieve that in the UK.
No one suggests that it couldn't work. Of course, it did work. But
well, I mean, if we hadn't seen it work elsewhere, I think that question would certainly have been asked. But as it had worked, it was in a sense you would say, well, it can do. So,
and it did work, of course, because
work is a relative term, but it certainly had an effect. Yeah.
So the primary objective, if you like, or one of the primary objectives, was to bring R below 1 because of the explosive.
Yeah, the primary strategic objective was to minimise mortality, and the principal tactical driver was to get R below 1.
Yes. Now, obviously, by the 23rd of March, the government had, in a series of measures, introduced interventions on the 12th and on the 16th and on the 20th. To what extent was there debate on the Monday and on the Sunday night of whether it was sensible or appropriate or advisable to allow just a bit more time for those earlier countermeasures to do their work, to have effect? If, as it happened, those countermeasures collectively were assisting in bringing R below 1, perhaps not immediately, but over time, that there was a prospect that they would succeed in bringing R below 1, was there consideration of waiting or delaying to see whether or not this final draconian step was indeed necessary? Perhaps another week to say, let's wait to see whether these measures, having bedded down, are bringing about compliance, are reducing R below 1, so we don't have to do this.
By the time we got to this weekend, I think nobody would have wanted to take the risk that would have gone with that, because if you then found out a week later that you hadn't got R below 1, you'd be in very deep trouble. We were already in very deep trouble, even deeper trouble. And moreover, it wasn't just a matter of trying to put it down just below 1. It was really trying to shrink this wave as fast as possible. So I don't recall any serious debate that said at this point, let's wait. I think the debate at this point was the numbers here are looking reasonably stark.
Let me put this point to you, please, Professor. No one wanted to take the risk because if you found out later that you weren't getting R below 1, then of course you'd be in even deeper trouble. The whole point about the introduction of the countermeasures the week before, and the week before that, was to try to bring R below 1. They obviously weren't introduced with a view, well, it's not going to work, that they were introduced in good faith to try to bring R below 1 in the same way as the ultimate lockdown measure sought to bring R below 1. Why was there not further consideration given to allowing that strategic aim, the secondary aim, if you like, to be brought about, to be given effect by more time, given that those countermeasures the week before presumably were introduced with good sense, in good faith, to try to bring R below 1?
It was. I think that it was really very clear from our modelling colleagues and more widely that the force of transmission, the countermeasures we were going to need, were, if anything, greater. That, in a sense, we realised as time went by, the force of transmission was harder and harder to get on top of. We were further along the curve than we thought we were going to be. It was clear we were not going to have enough data even to contemplate that for 2-3 weeks, which would be, in doubling term times, is potentially an extraordinarily big difference in transmission. So I think that in a sense, by this stage, the debate really, I don't think, would have made sense that said, well, let's wait 3 weeks, because we're already talking 2 to 3 weeks at least before you could say, is this having an effect? This wouldn't, by this stage, have been a safe thing to do if the principal aim is to avoid the worst possible implications for the NHS and increase mortality. So I think, in a sense, from a public health point of view, the arguments by this stage for action, I think, were very strong.
What about a week, though? The countermeasures from the previous week presumably had some effect in bringing R down. You couldn't know whether they were bringing them down speedily or slowly towards 1, or let alone below 1. but presumably they had some impact. They were doing something.
Oh, yes, and I think we all thought that they were going to slow down the rate of increase, but the question was, were they going to lead to an actual halving rather than doubling occurring? And that was, we were, certainly I was not in any way confident that that was going to happen. And if you're not confident in this kind of situation, this close to, in a sense, this close to the edge, you can't afford to take that risk. So I think that is if the aim is to minimise mortality, which was clearly the aim of ministers by this stage.
So is this the position? You couldn't know how effective the existing measures were. You would never know, likely, what impact they were having, but they were undoubtedly having some impact. But because you're dealing with an explosive, exponentially growing virus, the only way to go, as you saw it, was to apply a variant of the principle of go early, go hard. You've got to get on top of the problem and act harder, because the alternative of not acting is far worse. Is that the nub of it?
That is the nub of it, and I think it was possible to do, because in fact some fantastic civil servants, I'll call out Clara Swinson, who's given a witness statement to you, but others had kind of done preparation for these kind of eventualities. But the nub of it is exactly as you say, that we had to get on top of it by this stage if we were not to take a very significant risk with essentially with people's lives.
Now, I've said repeatedly to you, we'd look at the position of the NHS, and this is the final topic that I'm going to address you, ask you to address. In your report and wider across and more widely across government, it was plainly understood, and it had been understood for some weeks by the 23rd of March, that unless an appropriate degree of control was exercised over the growth of the virus and R was reduced below 1, the NHS would be, just to use one particular word, overwhelmed. Could we have, please, 274026 on the screen, which is a document in which, you've seen it before, Sir Chris, in which there are charts dealing with, in a very broad sense, the likely impact upon the NHS. 274026. This is, I think I've provided the wrong reference. We'll look at this one first then. What we've done, Professor, is that we've taken from as many of the SAGE and briefing and COBRA minutes as we can, the references to the likely impact upon the NHS. And if we just scroll through it, I'm not going to put you each one, that would be a ludicrous exercise, but you will get a flavour of how, by and large, the language varied considerably. At times, there were references to the NHS being severely disrupted, other times under extreme pressure, swamping the NHS resources, deluging the system. There were references to placing severe demands, the risk that the remaining peak will overwhelm the UK surge critical care bed capacity by 8-fold. And if we move forward to the most relevant time, the 21st of March, if we go back one page, please, if we go back one further page to the COVID-19 Strategy Ministerial Group meeting of the 21st of March, you'll see there the Chief Medical Officer, and you gave quite detailed figures about ICU capacity, said there have been 872 new cases identified the previous day. The critical question was how many cases were in the intensive treatment unit. This number was 335, of which 193 cases were in London. And you describe how, in normal circumstances, there are 700 ITU beds in London. If you go down to the bottom of the page, you will see there's a further reference to something that you said, and then over the page, I think it's Sir Patrick Vallance responding, the government chief scientific advisor said the data had been worked out in terms of doubling times. The supply of beds would become critical at about 3.5 doubling times on current projections. And the worst case scenario is ITU capacity in London would be overwhelmed in 9 days' time, but the projection was that this would happen in 15 days' time. Moving forward to the 22nd and the 23rd of March, perhaps we could pick it up at the 23rd of March in the ministerial group meeting. We can see there's a reference at the bottom of that page to the Chief Executive Officer of the NHS dealing with ratios in intensive care and that how they're being stretched in London. And the CEO talks about ventilators and staffing and so on and so forth. It is obvious that you and the government were provided with detailed information from the NHS SITREP reports. There was evidence from the Chief Executive of the NHS, evidence from Lord Stevens, a great deal of material talking about the likely impact on the NHS. But what was ultimately on the 23rd of March the final understanding as to the actuality of the likely impact on the NHS if this step were not taken? There is no, it seems to us, clear exposition on what the threshold test was that was being applied. Was it eightfold swamp? Was it overwhelmed? Was it severe pressure? Was it severe pressure with surge? Severe pressure without surge capacity? What was the understanding as to what would likely happen to the NHS if a lockdown were not imposed?
Well, I think that the first thing that was going to get to the point where it was no longer able to function in any sense close to normal, and to be clear, in every country in Europe, the health service came under huge pressures. This was inevitably going to happen in the event of the first wave and indeed subsequent waves. So just to put that caveat. But the ICU system was the first thing that was going to get overtopped to the point where actually it was no longer able to function under any normal circumstances. And the reason I would be very cautious about exact numbers is the reason that you have from St Patrick and others about doubling times. Because if your doubling time is for the sake of argument a week therefore is the difference between the ICU just coping, define that as you will, and having twice as many people as it can possibly absorb 2 weeks at the same rate, and it's 4 times. So you've got a situation where you really have almost no margin for error, and that is what we saw, was that the biggest pressure did come first to the intensive care system. It was across the whole board. Now, the NHS responded absolutely extraordinarily by 2 mechanisms. We'll probably debate that in another module, but just to say that one of them was expansion of the ICU footprint. So in my own hospital, that was...
I'm so sorry, Professor.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, please, to remain focused on the issue of what did you understand to be the level of degradation?
This is the part of the answer, which is the ICU footprint as it normally stood could be expanded and was expanded well beyond what it previously was. So in a sense, you couldn't, and this is the framing I actually used at the time, you have to reduce the flood, you also need to raise the riverbanks. And the raising the riverbanks bit was expanding the ICU, and the general capacity of the NHS, Nightingale hospitals, was the next stage along that. So, but in reality, the biggest limitation is always skilled personnel. That was always going to be the biggest thing that we had to deal with. Ventilators we worried about a lot, which we'll come on to in other modules, no doubt. So it wasn't a fixed number. That's the point I'm making on this.
There was a surge capacity.
There was some degree of surge capacity, but once you're on an exponential growth rate, until you stop that exponential growth rate, you are going to be overtopped sooner or later. And our view was, at the rate we were going, it was going to be sooner. I think putting exact numbers on that is a slightly spurious exercise for a variety of reasons. But that principle that you move from you're just below your absolute upper end of your margins to well above it in a very short time, I think is the key to understand here.
But you didn't know for sure that there would be exponential growth because you couldn't know whether the previous countermeasures would work or to what extent they would work. You were assessing the risk that there would remain an exponential growth and that eventually the NHS would be overwhelmed.
Yes.
Right. But as at the 23rd of March, did anybody within the NHS or on the part of government say clearly, the NHS will break if you do not take this particular step, because the footprint and the surge cannot accommodate on our figures the increase in beds and ICU beds that will be needed, and that therefore you must take this step, that the NHS won't just buckle, but it will break?
I think that ultimately, I think this understanding is what took ministers to the point of realising there was, if they wished to minimise mortality, no option, was to understand that if they did not take this action, it might not be 100% certain that the NHS would get to that point, but there was a high enough probability that it was simply not something that was an acceptable thing for the government to do if its aim was to minimise mortality. So that is very clearly, this risk was very, very heavy in driving, in my view, the decisions that ministers subsequently took.
But you're coming back there to the main mortality risk, aren't you? Or are you dealing there with the indirect? The indirect risk of the NHS?
This is essentially the combination of the direct mortality, what I called A mortality, and the indirect mortality due to the emergency system being overwhelmed. That's both the front door and the intensive care system being overwhelmed. And it was to protect those two all the way through the first 2 years of the pandemic, really, that a very large number of the actions in social distancing were taken. Not only to do that, but that was a very large part of the reason that ministers took the decisions they took.
But I want to be absolutely clear about this. On the 23rd of March, there was nobody saying, putting aside the terrible pressure, the strain, and despite uses of words such as overtopping or overwhelming or whatever epithet or description might have been used, the NHS will break by a given date. The analysis was different. It was, unless you take this step and promote the prospect or increase the chances that you will bring R below 1, at some point the NHS will break.
At some point
That's
soon.
the analysis.
At some point soon.
But no one knew when it would be.
No, because of the nature of exponential curves and the lack of contemporaneous data on the speed of transmission by this stage, given the magnificent response of people already to the voluntary measures. But I think this is not a risk, frankly, that any minister whose principal aim was to reduce mortality would be wanting to take at this stage.
So ultimately, it was a risk analysis.
Yes.
It wasn't, and I ask this because, of course, so much has been said in the public domain, it wasn't because there was data in front of ministers saying the NHS will collapse, you must therefore act. It was a risk analysis. Unless the R is brought below 1 and the exponential growth is reversed, it will collapse at some point. And you couldn't be sure that the existing measures would suffice. That's the number.
Yes, I mean, I don't personally see a big difference between the two positions you've taken, but in a sense I would agree with both of them. I think they both end up in the same place.
All right. Now, just...
I don't know how much more you have, Mr. Keek. I know there are many CP questions. I've been asked to take a break, so...
I was just going to put two final matters, and then if it was all right, allowed to take a break, and then we can move to the Rule 10s.
Okay.
Eat out to help out. Do you agree that there wasn't a full, or indeed perhaps any consultation with the CMO or DCMO or the OCMO over that scheme?
Yes, my written statement makes clear there was no consultation. There's no consultation.
I need to put to you that in his witness statement, Boris Johnson says, quote, it was properly discussed, including with Chris and Patrick. Do you agree with that? Or
I on this one, neither Patrick nor I can recall it, and I think we would have done.
In relation to the summer and the autumn, and I'm not going to
Yeah, and actually, if I can just add to that, and I made fairly firmly to number 10, not to the Prime Minister, the view that it would have been prudent, let's put it that way, for them to have thought about discussing it before it was launched. And this was aimed at the centre. I was unsurprised that Treasury and many other ministries were coming up with various schemes. It's perfectly legitimate. Number 10 held the ring, and I felt, so it may well be correct that the Prime Minister was under the impression we had been consulted, but it was not the fact that we were consulted, and that difference, I think, is probably worth just highlighting. And I think we should have been.
Yes. Yes, I mean, his assertion is it was properly discussed. He doesn't say he was given the impression it was discussed. He does appear to assert it was. Briefly, and briefly because it is absolutely apparent, you may agree that throughout the summer and the autumn, Sage, yourself, Sir Patrick, had a clear view in public health technical terms as to the likelihood or perhaps inevitability of a second wave. And therefore, you constantly, consistently raised your concerns, and there are multiple letters, strategy notes, meetings at which you say a second wave is coming. If you relax too quickly, too early, the combination of those relaxations, or if you don't take in combination sufficient steps thereafter to restrict the growth in our reproduction rate, you're going to end up with another serious outbreak, second wave, and with all the consequences that we're now so familiar with. That position was a public health position. It was, of course, for the government to decide how to weigh up that position against economic, societal, and many other considerations. Do you consider that in public health terms, the government had an option, a realistic option, but to impose the second lockdown? And I'm very carefully not asking you about to enter into the debate about economic, societal, against public health considerations. Just on the public health side, was there a public health option?
By the time it had got to the stage of the second lockdown, given the principal aims of ministers to minimise mortality, I couldn't see many options. Whether other decisions could have been taken earlier to have prevented that, I think is a separate and quite important question. But in terms of once we got to that point, I think the realisation was there wasn't really much choice.
And by that reference to earlier measures, had there perhaps been a circuit breaker in September, had perhaps a tier level system been introduced earlier and had time to work over a longer period of time, there remains the possibility that that second lockdown might not have been necessary or might not have been as long.
I think that is. I think most people would say that's the case. I think there are a variety of ways we could have potentially at least had a less onerous lockdown than we did on the second one. The third one, in my view, because it was a new variant, I think I would say probably we didn't have many choices. But on this one, I thought it was inevitable by the time we got there, but wasn't necessarily inevitable had previous decisions been different.
But your reference to the third lockdown, is that a reference to how the Alpha Kent, so-called originally variant, swept everything else away because it of course, in epidemiological terms, swept across the country?
Yeah, I had hugely greater transmissibility, and at that point, I don't think whatever government had done up to the run-up, I don't think that could have been avoided or significantly modified. But I do think there's a strong argument that we could have ended up in a different trajectory between summer and, for the sake of argument, New Year 2020.
In public health terms, other steps could and perhaps should have been taken that may have obviated the need for the second and third lockdowns, at least in the form in which they occurred.
Yeah, my worry, and you'll have seen this from my correspondence, was that we were kind of bunny hopping potentially, where we would accelerate into a bend unnecessarily and then have to slam on the brakes because it was clear we'd overdone things. And I think I'm not going to go through the long list of things. You've got all the documents, but that position I maintain fairly consistently.
Lady, those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. I shall return at 11:15.
All rise.